What would you do if your neighbors used your property as their personal highway for 3 years? Destroying your crops and ignoring every attempt at civil conversation. I thought I knew. Until the day I watched Karen's pristine Mercedes sink into the carefully placed mud pit I dug right where she always cut through my cornfield. What I didn't expect was her sister showing up with a lawyer, claiming I'd committed a felony. And what none of us expected was what the security cameras would reveal about who was really behind the damage to my farm all along. This is the story of how a simple property dispute turned into the most shocking courtroom drama of my life. My name is David Martinez, and for 15 years, I've worked the same 40-acre farm that my grandfather left me in rural Ohio. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest, and every season I've managed to scrape together enough profit to keep the lights on and food on the table for my wife Sarah and our 2 kids. The trouble started 3 years ago when the Henderson sisters moved into the massive house that overlooks my property from the hill above. Karen, the eldest at 45, drove a spotless white Mercedes. Lisa, 42, preferred her black BMW SUV, and Jana, the youngest at 38, rotated between a red Porsche and a silver Audi depending on her mood. At first, I didn't mind when they occasionally cut through the corner of my land to avoid the longer route around the property line. My grandfather always said good neighbors make life easier for everyone, but occasionally became daily. Daily became multiple times per day, and what started as careful driving along the edge of my fields became reckless. Shortcuts straight through my crops. I tried talking to them. The first time I approached Karen's front door, she answered with a wine glass in her hand at 2 in the afternoon. "Excuse me, Karen. I'm David from the farm below. I was wondering if we could discuss the driving situation." She looked at me like I'd asked her to solve quantum physics. "What driving situation?" "Your family has been driving through my cornfield pretty regularly, and it's starting to damage the crops. Could you maybe use the road instead?" Karen's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, that little patch of dirt." "David, sweetie, we're not hurting anything. It's just faster this way." "But the tire tracks are..." "Look," she interrupted, "we bought this house for the convenience. That includes convenient access. I'm sure you understand." I didn't understand, but I tried to remain neighborly. "Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement. You could pay for the damaged crops, or perhaps we could formalize an easement." The wine glass came down hard on her doorframe. "Pay for driving across some weeds? I don't think so, David. Find something better to worry about." The door slammed in my face. Over the next year, I tried everything. I put up no trespassing signs. They drove around them. I installed reflector posts to mark the property line. The sisters knocked them down. I even offered to split the cost of improving the actual road access to their house. Karen told me she'd rather eat glass than negotiate with a dirt farmer. Sarah watched me come home more frustrated each day. "Why don't you just call the police?" she asked one evening as we surveyed the latest damage to our winter wheat. I considered it, but Sheriff Morrison had been clear when I'd mentioned it in passing. Property disputes between neighbors are civil matters, Dave, unless someone's stealing or vandalizing. It's not really our jurisdiction. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday in October. I was checking the irrigation lines in the east field when I heard the familiar roar of an engine. Lisa's BMW came tearing through my pumpkin patch, spraying mud and orange pulp in every direction. She wasn't just cutting through anymore, she was joyriding. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I spent the next 2 weeks studying property law, researching legal protections for farmers, and yes, I'll admit it, getting creative about solutions. Sarah thought I'd lost my mind when I started digging what she called David's revenge pit in the exact spot where Karen always entered my property. "This is going to backfire," Sarah warned me. "They'll sue us into bankruptcy." But I was tired of being walked on, literally. I made the pit just deep enough to stop a car without causing injury, about 2.5 feet deep and 6 feet wide. Then I covered it with a thin layer of plywood, dirt, and corn stalks. To the casual observer, it looked like every other part of the field. On a Friday morning in November, I was replacing a fence post when I heard it, the satisfying sound of a Mercedes engine. Sputtering to a halt, I turned to see Karen's pristine white car sitting axle deep in my perfectly crafted mud trap, her face visible through the windshield in a mask of absolute rage. She was screaming into her phone before I even reached the car. "Lisa, get down here now. That psychotic farmer booby-trapped his field." "Ma'am," I said as calmly as possible, "you're on my property without permission. Would you like me to call a tow truck?" Karen's eyes blazed with fury. "You did this on purpose. I dug a drainage ditch on my own land. How you ended up in it is between you and your driving choices." 3 days later, the certified letter arrived. Sarah found me reading it at the kitchen table, my coffee growing cold in my hands. "What does it say?" she asked. I looked up at my wife, feeling the weight of what was coming. They're suing us for $50,000 in damages. And Karen's filed a police report claiming I set a malicious trap with intent to cause harm. Sarah sank into the chair across from me. "Intent to cause harm? David, that's a felony." I finished. "Sheriff Morrison is coming by tomorrow to take my statement. If they can prove I intended to hurt someone, I could be looking at up to 5 years in prison." The next morning, I watched through the kitchen window as the sheriff's car pulled into my driveway. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I wondered if my grandfather would have been proud of what I'd done, or if I'd just destroyed everything he'd built. Sheriff Morrison sat across from me at my kitchen table, his notepad open and his expression unreadable. I'd known Bill Morrison since high school, back when we both played JV football and dreamed of futures that didn't involve small-town drama. "Dave, I've got to ask you straight," he said. "Did you dig that pit intending to damage someone's vehicle?" I chose my words carefully. I dug a drainage system on my property to address water pooling issues in that section of the field. If someone chose to drive through my crops without permission and ended up stuck, that's a consequence of trespassing. Bill wrote something down. "Karen Henderson says you've been threatening her family." "Threatening? Bill, I asked them politely to stop driving through my crops multiple times. I even offered to pay for improving their actual driveway access. She's got a different story, says you've been hostile and aggressive. Made comments about teaching them a lesson." My hands tightened around my coffee mug. That's complete fabrication, but even as I said it, doubt crept in. Had I said something that could be twisted? In my frustration, had I made some offhand comment that Karen could use against me after Bill left? I called the only lawyer I knew, Tom Bradley, who'd handled my grandfather's will. Tom's office was a single room above the hardware store, but he'd been practicing law for 30 years. "Dave, I'll be straight with you," Tom said after I explained the situation. "This isn't a simple property dispute anymore. If they can convince a prosecutor that you set a trap with malicious intent, you're looking at felony charges, and their civil suit for damages could bankrupt you regardless. So what do? We gather evidence. Every interaction you had with them, any witnesses to their trespassing, documentation of crop damage, and we pray they don't have anything that makes you look vindictive." That weekend, I walked every inch of my property, photographing the tire tracks and damaged crops. Sarah helped me compile receipts for lost harvest and repair costs. The evidence was overwhelming. 3 years of systematic trespassing had cost us nearly $8,000 in damages. But on Monday morning, Tom called with news that made my stomach drop. "Dave, you need to sit down. I just got off the phone with their attorney, Margaret Chen. She's one of the best civil litigation lawyers in the state, and she says they have security footage." "Security footage of what?" "You digging the pit. Apparently, the Henderson house has a camera system that overlooks part of your property. Chen claims the footage shows you measuring, planning, and deliberately constructing what she's calling a vehicle trap." I felt the blood drain from my face. I'd been so focused on staying on my own property that I hadn't considered their house might have cameras. "There's more," Tom continued. "Chen says Karen has been keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with you, including dates and alleged verbal threats. She's painting a picture of escalating harassment culminating in a premeditated attack. On their property, they were trespassing on my land. That's our defense. But Dave, we need to be realistic. If they have footage of you planning and building that pit, combined with documented complaints about your behavior, this could go very badly. That evening, Sarah found me sitting in the barn, staring at the floor. "Talk to me," she said, settling beside me on a hay bale. "I might have destroyed us, Sarah. Prison time, bankruptcy, losing the farm all because I couldn't stand being walked on." She took my hand. "You were protecting what's ours, was I? Or was I just being petty and vindictive for the first time since this started?" I genuinely questioned my actions. Had my pride pushed me too far? 2 days later, Tom called with unexpected. Dave, I've been thinking about the security footage situation. Chen was very specific about what it shows you digging, measuring, planning. But she hasn't mentioned audio. Why does that matter? Because if there's no audio, they can't prove your intent. Digging a hole on your property isn't illegal. It's only criminal if you intended to cause harm. But the deliberate placement could be explained by legitimate agricultural needs. Dave, where exactly did you dig that pit? I closed my eyes, visualizing the field, right where water tends to pool after heavy rain. It's always been a problem spot. And you said you told the sheriff it was drainage related, because it actually was, partly. I mean, yes, I wanted to stop them from driving through, but that area does have drainage issues. Tom was quiet for a moment. Dave, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. When you were digging that pit, what was going through your mind? I thought back to that morning, remembering my frustration, my anger, but also, I remember thinking about my grandfather, how he always said you have to stand up for what's yours, but you have to be smart about it. I wasn't just trying to hurt them, Tom. I wanted them to face consequences for their actions. And the placement, the depth, I made it just deep enough to stop a car, not flip it. I didn't want anyone getting hurt, just stuck. Tom's voice carried a note of hope. That might be the key, Dave. Intent to stop trespassing isn't the same as intent to cause harm. But we're going to need more than your word. What do you mean? We need evidence that supports your version of events. Documentation of drainage, problems, witness testimony about their trespassing. Anything that shows this was about protecting your property, not malicious revenge. That night, I lay awake thinking about my grandfather's words. Sometimes doing right means doing what others won't understand until later. I hope he was right, because in 3 weeks, I'd be sitting in a courtroom, fighting for my freedom and everything my family had built. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice wondered if there was more to this story than even I knew. The Hancock County Courthouse felt smaller than I remembered from my jury duty years ago, but somehow more intimidating. I sat beside Tom Bradley at the defendant's table, watching Margaret Chen organize what appeared to be an arsenal of documents and exhibits at the plaintiff's table. Karen Henderson sat behind her attorney, wearing a Navy business suit and an expression of righteous indignation that she'd probably been practicing in the mirror. Judge Patricia Walsh entered, and the bailiff called court to order. I'd heard she was fair, but no nonsense, with little patience for frivolous lawsuits or obvious lies. I hope Tom was right about that. Your Honor, Chen began, standing with theatrical precision. This case represents a clear example of premeditated assault using a dangerous trap. Mr. Martinez deliberately constructed a vehicle pit designed to cause damage and potential injury to anyone who dared cross his property. She clicked a remote, and suddenly the courtroom's overhead screen displayed aerial footage of my farm. Zoomed in on the area where I'd dug the pit, security cameras from my client's residence captured Mr. Martinez over a 2-week period, measuring, digging, and carefully concealing this trap in the exact location where the Henderson family had been crossing for years. My heart sank as I watched myself on screen, pacing off distances, digging with purposeful intensity, without context. It looked exactly like what Chen claimed premeditation. Furthermore, Chen continued, Ms. Henderson has documented a pattern of increasingly hostile behavior from Mr. Martinez, including verbal threats and intimidation tactics. Karen took the witness stand, her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine emotion. He told me I'd pay for what I was doing, she testified. He said he'd find a way to stop us, no matter what it took. The last time I spoke with him, he looked me right in the eye and said, "You'll regret taking me for granted." I leaned over to Tom. "I never said that." He nodded, making notes. "We'll address it on cross." Chen presented receipts for Karen's car repairs, $4,800 for axle damage, realignment, and mud removal. She also submitted medical bills for $1,100, claiming Karen had suffered neck strain from the sudden stop. This wasn't a simple property dispute, Chen concluded. This was a calculated attack on private citizens, exercising what they believed to be established use rights on adjacent property. When Tom stood for cross-examination, his first question surprised everyone. "Ms. Henderson, in 3 years of crossing Mr. Martinez's property, did you ever ask permission?" We didn't think we needed to. It seemed like unused land. Unused land with growing crops that you admit your vehicle's damaged. Karen's composure cracked slightly. The damage was minimal. Tom pulled out a folder of photographs. "Your Honor, the fence exhibit of photographs show entire tracks through corn, wheat, and pumpkin crops, representing thousands of dollars in agricultural damage." He placed the photos in front of Karen. "Does this look minimal to you?" "Well, compared to what he did to my car." "Miss Henderson, did you ever offer to compensate Mr. Martinez for crop damage?" "No." "But did you ever attempt to find an alternative route?" "It would have been inconvenient." "So your convenience justified destroying his livelihood?" Chen objected, but the damage was done. Karen's entitlement was on full display. When I took the stand, Tom walked me through 3 years of increasingly desperate attempts to stop the trespassing. "Mr. Martinez, when you dug what Miss Henderson calls a trap, what was your primary intention?" "To stop the trespassing without anyone getting hurt. That area has always had drainage problems, and I figured killing the birds with one stone made sense." "Did you want to injure anyone?" "Absolutely not. I made it just deep enough to stop a vehicle, not cause a rollover or injury." Then Chen stood for cross-examination, and I knew this was where everything would be decided. "Mr. Martinez, you spent 2 weeks planning and constructing this pit, correct?" "I spent 2 weeks addressing a problem on my property." "Yes, a problem that coincidentally appeared exactly where my client typically crossed your land. A problem that existed in the same location where your client chose to trespass." "Yes." Chen smiled coldly. "Mr. Martinez, isn't it true that you told Sheriff Morrison, and I quote, 'If they want to treat my property like a highway, maybe they need to learn about road hazards'?" My blood went cold. I had said something like that, joking with Bill Morrison, months earlier, but in court, it sounded vindictive and calculated. I may have made a frustrated comment that proves premeditated intent. That's when Tom stood up with an expression I'd never seen before. "Your Honor, the fence would like to call a surprise witness." Chen looked shocked. "Objection, we weren't given notice of additional witnesses." "Your Honor, this witness came forward just this morning with information directly relevant to the prosecution's case." Judge Walsh frowned. "Proceed, Mr. Bradley, but this better be worth a disruption." The fence called Jonna Henderson. The courtroom went silent. Karen's face went white as her youngest sister walked slowly toward the witness stand. I watched Lisa Henderson in the gallery grab her phone, her face a mask of panic. Jonna was sworn in, and Tom approached carefully. "Miss Henderson, you're the defendant's neighbor and sister to the plaintiff, correct?" "Yes." "Do you have information relevant to this case?" Jonna looked directly at Karen, tears forming in her eyes. "My sisters lied about everything." The courtroom erupted. Judge Walsh called for order as Chen jumped to her feet with objections. "Ms. Henderson," Tom continued once quiet returned, "please tell the court what you mean." Karen and Lisa planned This whole thing, they knew David was going to do something to stop us anyone would have. But they wanted him to, because Jeanette's voice broke, because of the life insurance policy on our property. They needed a lawsuit, something that would force David to sell his farm cheap. Karen's been planning to buy it and develop it for 2 years. The revelation hit the courtroom like a bomb. Karen was on her feet, screaming denials. But Jeanette continued through tears. The journal Karen kept, she wrote most of it after the fact. The threats David supposedly made, she made them up, and the security footage. Jeanette looked straight at me with an expression of pure guilt. It doesn't show the whole story. Judge Walsh called for a recess, but I barely heard her. Everything I thought I knew about this case had just flipped upside down. During the recess, I sat in the courthouse hallway trying to process what had just happened. Jana Henderson paced nervously near the water fountain, while Karen and Lisa huddled with their attorney, their whispered argument growing heated enough that other people began to stare. Tom pulled me aside. Dave, Jana called me this morning. She's been carrying this guilt for months. But there's more you need to know before we go back in there. More. What else could there be? The security footage Chen's been threatening to use, it apparently shows something different than what she claimed. Jana says the cameras caught Karen and Lisa deliberately damaging your crops on multiple occasions. When they thought you weren't watching, my head spun. They were doing it on purpose. Worse than that, according to Jana, they researched property law and knew exactly how far they could push before you'd retaliate. They wanted you to do something they could sue over. When court reconvened, Judge Walsh's expression was stern. Mr. Bradley, your witness's testimony has made serious allegations. I'm going to allow you to continue, but I want facts, not family drama. Tom nodded. Jana, you mentioned security footage. Can you tell us what it actually shows? Jana glanced at her sisters, then looked down at her hands. The cameras on our house. They cover most of David's East Field. For the past year, the footage shows Karen and Lisa deliberately driving through crops, spinning tires to cause extra damage, even getting out to knock down his fence posts. The courtroom buzzed with shocked murmurs. They would watch from the house until David left, then go tear up his field. Karen said it was softening him up for what she called the big plan. Chen stood up. Your Honor, I object to this entire line of testimony. Ms. Henderson is clearly trying to deflect from her family's victimization by sit down. Counselor, Judge Walsh said sharply. Ms. Henderson, what was this big plan? Jeanette's voice was barely audible. Karen works for a development company. She found out David's farm is zoned for commercial development. The land is worth almost $2 million for retail construction, but only if David would sell. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. She needed leverage, I whispered. Tom heard me. Jana, did your sister plan to force Mr. Martinez into a lawsuit? Yes. She said if she could get him arrested for assault or get a big enough civil judgment against him, he'd have to sell the farm to pay legal fees and damages. She was going to buy it through her company for almost nothing, then flip it to developers. Karen finally exploded. You lying little. Judge Walsh's gavel came down hard. Miss Henderson, control yourself or you'll be removed from my courtroom. But Karen was beyond control. Johnny, you know nothing about business. That farm is wasted. On him. I was going to create jobs, build something useful, instead of letting him grow weeds. You were going to destroy our neighbor's life for profit. Johnny shot back. Tom looked at Chen. Counselor, I believe your client just confessed to conspiracy to commit fraud. That's when Margaret Chen did something I'll never forget. She closed her laptop, gathered her papers, and stood up. Your Honor, after hearing this testimony, I'm withdrawing as counsel for the plaintiff. I cannot in good conscience continue representing someone who may have committed the crimes my client is alleging against the defendant. The courtroom fell silent except for Karen's panic breathing. Judge Walsh turned to Jana. Ms. Henderson, do you have access to the security footage you described? Yes, Your Honor. I brought copies. Jana pulled a USB drive from her purse. Everything from the past year. Karen doesn't know I kept copies. 30 minutes later, we were all watching footage on the courtroom screen that showed exactly what Johnny had described. Karen and Lisa Henderson systematically destroying my crops while I was away, laughing as they spun donuts through my wheat field, even bringing a crowbar to damage my irrigation equipment. But the most damning footage was from the day after Karen's car got stuck in my pit. The video showed both sisters measuring the pit, taking photographs, and Lisa saying clearly, "This is perfect. Dave just handed us $1 million." Judge Walsh looked at Karen with barely concealed disgust. "Miss Henderson, based on the evidence presented today, I'm not only dismissing your lawsuit against Mr. Martinez, I'm ordering you to pay his legal fees and compensating him for documented crop damage in the amount of $12,000. Karen started to object, but the judge continued, "Furthermore, I'm referring this case to the district attorney's office for investigation of fraud, conspiracy, and filing false police reports. Bailiff, please see that copies of all evidence are delivered to the DA immediately." As the gavel fell, I felt a weight I've been carrying for months finally lift from my shoulders. Outside the courthouse, Johnny approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Martinez, I'm so sorry. I should have stopped them sooner. But Karen and Lisa, they've always been able to convince me that wrong was right." I shook her hand. "Johnny, you did the right thing when it mattered most." That took courage. 3 months later, Karen and Lisa both pled guilty to conspiracy charges and were sentenced to community service and restitution. Karen lost her job with the development company, and both sisters ended up selling their house to pay legal fees. Ironically, they got far less than market value in a rush sale. But the real twist came 6 months after the trial, when Johnny knocked on my door with a business proposal. "David, I inherited some money from our grandmother's estate. I was wondering, would you be interested in a silent partner for expanding your farm operation? I think there's room for an honest business relationship between our families today." Henderson Martinez Agricultural Partnership spans 60 acres and employs for full-time workers. We specialize in organic vegetables for farmers markets throughout Ohio. And yes, we have excellent security cameras covering every inch of the property. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, but sometimes justice and good business make even better partners. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever dealt with neighbors who thought your property was their personal playground? Share your stories in the comments below, and remember, sometimes standing up for what's right means being patient enough to let the truth reveal itself. Subscribe for more real-life legal dramas. And remember, your property rights matter, but there's always more to the story than meets the eye.